We are 192 nations and countries, and we are like Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park. We just speak and nobody implements our decisions. We are mere decorations without any real substance. We're just the Speaker's Corner. No more, no less. We make speeches and then disappear. This is who you are right now. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi addressed the United Nations General Assembly, shedding light on why some sought to remove him from power. Criticism of the UN's favoritism towards certain powerful nations, rather than prioritizing the well-being of all member states, has been prevalent among African leaders and developing nations. Zimbabwe's former president, Robert Mugabe, echoed this sentiment during the 72nd General Assembly in 2017, advocating strongly for reforms within the UN. Mugabe emphasized the need for a clear vision for the future of the UN that avoids vague concepts that could be exploited by states seeking to interfere in the affairs of others. His comments referred to what he termed as a deceptive humanitarian operation in Libya in 2011, which ultimately led to Gaddafi's demise. Gaddafi's singular appearance at the UN, where he delivered a speech lasting 90 minutes instead of the allotted 15, raised eyebrows and highlighted deeper issues with the organization's structure. The UN Security Council, established by a handful of nations after World War II, grants veto power to its 5 permanent members, often resulting in paralysis when it comes to addressing global crises. This structural flaw was evident in instances like the Syrian conflict, where resolutions for peace were thwarted by Russian and Chinese vetoes, prolonging the suffering of the Syrian people. Similarly, Russia's use of veto power blocked investigations into tragedies, such as the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight M17 and condemned Crimea's secession from Ukraine. These examples underscore the urgent need for reforms within the UN, particularly concerning the functioning of the Security Council, to ensure it can effectively fulfill its mandate of promoting peace and security worldwide. In historical records, the USSR held the veto record until 1990, with Russia wielding its veto power around 13 times. Similarly, the United States has exercised its veto authority 79 times, often rejecting proposals related to Israel, including the establishment of a Palestinian state, condemnation of illegal settlements, and advocating for the return of expelled Palestinians. Since its inception in 1946, there have been a total of 263 vetoes, illustrating the significant challenges faced by the UN. Muammar Gaddafi emphasized this historical context, highlighting that the organization was initially conceived with the interests of a select few nations in mind, leaving many others marginalized. Gaddafi pointed out the lack of representation in the UN's early days, stressing the ongoing disparity between the organization's ideals and the realities faced by many member states. He noted that only 4 African countries, namely Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa, were among the founding members in 1945. However, South Africa's independence was marred by the oppressive apartheid regime, which subjected the majority of its population to discrimination and tyranny under minority white rule. Despite the UN's mandate to uphold the interests of all member nations, it has often fallen short in addressing atrocities committed within its own ranks, notably in South Africa during the apartheid era. Despite gaining formal independence in 1910, South Africa remained plagued by racial segregation until the abolition of apartheid in 1994, marking a significant stride towards true freedom and equality for all its citizens. Additionally, when the United Nations was formed, most African nations were still under colonial rule. Nigeria gained independence in 1960, Ghana in 1957, and Algeria in 1962. While the UN might have played a role in expediting their independence, its effectiveness and commitment to the interests of these newly independent governments were questionable. Significantly, certain regions within these newly independent nations remained under the control of colonial powers like the United Kingdom and France. This disparity between the aspirations of the UN and the realities faced by African states at the time was starkly evident. Muammar Gaddafi, an advocate for UN reform, highlighted the absence of approximately 165 nations during the organization's inception, with only 1 present for every 8 missing. He underscored the discrepancy between the UN Charter's preamble, which was drafted collectively during the 1945 San Francisco Conference, and the subsequent articles and rules of the Security Council. Gaddafi pointed out that while the preamble reflected the contributions of all attending nations, the specifics of the Security Council were determined by a select group of experts and countries united against Germany during World War II. This historical context sheds light on the foundational principles and inherent limitations of the United Nations. The clauses that come after the preamble directly oppose its principles. We refuse to accept these clauses and will not abide by them. They belong to a bygone era, concluding with the Second World War. The preamble clearly states that all nations, regardless of size, are equal. Are we equal when it comes to the permanent seats? No, we are not equal. The preamble states in writing that all nations are equal, whether they are small or large. Do we have the right of veto? Are we equal? The preamble says that we have equal rights, whether we are large or small. That is what is stated and what we agreed in the preamble, so the veto contradicts the Charter, and the permanent seats contradict the Charter. We neither accept nor recognize the veto. What he said is undeniably true. There is no deception in his remarks. In terms of veto power and the allotment of permanent seat, equality is lacking. The 5 nations with veto power are viewed as superior, allowing them to use their power as they see best. The preamble of the Charter states that armed forces shall not be used except in the common interest, Gaddafi stated. That is the preamble to the Charter that we agreed to and signed, and we joined the UN because we wanted the Charter to reflect that. It's declared that armed forces should only be used for the collective benefit of all nations, but what has unfolded since then? Since the establishment of the United Nations and its Security Council, 65 conflicts have erupted over 65 years, resulting in millions more casualties than the Second World War. Are these 65 wars, along with the aggression and force employed, truly in everyone's best interests? No, they serve the interests of a select few countries, not all. This contradicts the principles of the United Nations Charter, which we have agreed to uphold. Until we adhere to the Charter's principles, we will refuse to accept it and will not shy away from diplomatic discussions. As we discuss the future of the UN, there should be no room for hypocrisy or diplomacy, as the fate of our planet hangs in the balance. The 65 conflicts since the UN's inception have been fueled by hypocrisy. According to the preamble, if armed force is necessary, it must be a UN force, authorized by the UN, rather than the deployment of armed forces by a handful of nations. In order to uphold global peace and security, the entire United Nations body must collectively decide on military action. Since its establishment in 1945, the UN has maintained that if one nation aggresses against another, the entire organization should deter and prevent such behavior. For instance, if a country like Libya were to act aggressively towards France, the UN as a whole would respond, as France is a sovereign member state of the organization, and it's the shared responsibility of all nations to protect each other's sovereignty. However, despite this principle, there have been 65 conflicts where the UN did not intervene to stop them. Additionally, 8 significant wars involving member nations with veto power have occurred, resulting in the deaths of almost 2 million people. Despite claims of preserving sovereignty and independence, some governments have engaged in aggressive actions against other nations. While they may portray themselves as champions of global peace and security, they have instead initiated wars and hostile actions, causing immense suffering. These governments have secured permanent seats in the Security Council and wield the power of veto. They have instigated wars resulting in the deaths of millions, contradicting the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of nations, as outlined in the UN Charter. Therefore, no nation has the authority to interfere in the internal affairs of any government, whether it be democratic, dictatorial, socialist, capitalist, reactionary, or progressive. This responsibility falls upon each civilization and is an internal matter for the people of the respective country. For example, in ancient Rome, when it suited the interests of the senators, they appointed Julius Caesar as dictator. It cannot be claimed that Rome granted Caesar veto power at that time, as the UN Charter does not refer to such authority. Upon joining the United Nations, we believed in the principle of equality among nations, only to realize that one country can veto any decision we make. Who designated the permanent members of the Security Council? 4 nations bestowed this status upon themselves. While China's permanent membership was democratically decided, the allocation of other seats was imposed undemocratically against our will. We must reject this totalitarian method. There is a pressing need for fundamental restructuring within the United Nations. Simply adding more superpowers to the Security Council will only lead to further discord. Instead, the focus should be on strengthening democracy within the UN. The General Assembly should be entrusted with greater authority, becoming the world's legislative body, while the Security Council would serve as a mechanism to implement its decisions. This democratic forum should oversee the Security Council, and its resolutions should carry legal weight. It is imperative to reject the current status quo and empower the lawmakers of UN member states to enact enforceable resolutions. In the current setup, it's often believed that the General Assembly follows the Security Council's directives. However, the true essence of the United Nations lies in the General Assembly, representing 192 nations. It's not just the Security Council with its 15 member countries that should hold sway. How can we expect genuine global peace and security when the decisions are dictated by only 5 nations out of 192? We resemble Hyde Park's Speaker's Corner, where everyone speaks but nothing substantial is achieved. We're mere ornaments without any real impact. We've become mere speakers, offering remarks and then departing without any action taken. If the Security Council becomes solely responsible for implementing decisions endorsed by the General Assembly, there would be no need for competition in its membership. It should represent all nations fairly, including permanent seats for unions and groups like the European Union with its 27 member states. The African Union, Southern African Development Community, SADC, Arab League, and the Islamic Conference, with their significant memberships, should also have permanent seats. This would ensure a more balanced and inclusive representation in the Security Council. The non-aligned movement, consisting of 118 member nations, should secure permanent seats in the Security Council. Additionally, the G100 presents another viable option. It's also worth considering granting prominent seats to minor nations. For countries not affiliated with the mentioned unions, a rotating permanent seat system could be implemented, with occupancy changing every 6 or 12 months. Nations like Japan and Australia, not part of ASEAN, or the Russian Federation, lacking membership in the European, Latin American, or African unions, could benefit from this arrangement if approved by the General Assembly. The urgency of this matter cannot be overstated. As previously mentioned, the General Assembly serves as the world's Congress and Parliament, representing all nations. Those not part of this assembly risk being sidelined. Mr. Ali Abdusalam Treki, President of the Assembly, and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon will collaborate on drafting the legislative document and forming necessary committees to present this proposal for a vote. This would transform the Security Council into a union of states. This approach allows us to shape the future of the United Nations with justice and democracy, moving away from a Security Council dominated by nations chosen for their nuclear capabilities, economic strength, or technological prowess. Terrorism remains a significant concern, and we must not allow superpowers to dominate the Security Council. Doing so would perpetuate a form of terrorism in itself. To achieve a unified, safe, and peaceful world, this is the path we must pursue. Failure to address these issues will result in continued strife and conflict, potentially lasting until the end of days or the demise of our planet. Therefore, every member of the Security Council should possess veto power, or alternatively, we should abolish the veto altogether under this new council structure. This proposed Security Council embodies true security. As outlined in the revised recommendations presented to the General Assembly, there will be an Executive Council accountable to the General Assembly, wielding genuine authority and establishing regulations. Under this framework, all nations will be treated equally in the Security Council, mirroring the equality observed in the General Assembly. Just as membership and voting rights are equal in the General Assembly, so too should they be in the Security Council. Currently, the Security Council operates with unequal power dynamics, with some nations holding veto power while others do not, and disparities in permanent seat allocation. This disparity is unacceptable, as is any resolution issued by the Security Council in its current form. Having emerged from colonialism and trusteeship, we have become self-sufficient nations. Today, we convene to determine a democratic approach that ensures the peace and security of all nations, regardless of size, on equal footing. Failure to address these issues perpetuates a form of terrorism. Terrorism is not limited to groups like Al-Qaeda. It includes any disregard for democratic principles. Therefore, decisions of the General Assembly should be upheld, as they represent the majority will of nations. No entity is superior to the General Assembly. Any entity claiming superiority over the Assembly should exit the UN and operate independently. Democracy is for all, irrespective of wealth, power, or affiliation with terrorism. It's imperative that all nations are treated equally and perceived as such. The current structure of the Security Council resembles political feudalism, with permanent members wielding their positions to their advantage at the expense of others. This has led to the Council being dubbed the Terror Council instead of the Security Council. The selective use of the Security Council to further political agendas is evident. While some nations invoke the United Nations Charter and Chapter 7 to promote their interests, they conveniently ignore it when it does not serve their purpose. Granting veto power to select members is unjust and tantamount to terrorism, and we refuse to accept it. We refuse to live under the shadow of injustice and fear. Superpowers utilize their veto power to safeguard their global interests, often at the expense of the Third World, forcing them into submission. Since its inception in 1945, the Security Council has failed to ensure security. Instead, it has instilled fear and imposed sanctions, working against our interests. Following this address, we will no longer blindly adhere to Security Council decisions that are detrimental to us. While permanent seats may hold significance for some, we will not be subjected to their control or allow the veto power to be used against us. We will not grant superpowers the authority to treat us as inferior nations. It's not within our authority to designate which nations are considered superpowers and grant them the privilege of acting on behalf of all 192 nations. We've made a deliberate decision to disregard Security Council decisions, as they disproportionately target us, while the superpowers with permanent seats and veto power remain immune to such resolutions. These authorities never hold themselves accountable, using resolutions against us while exempting themselves. This misuse has rendered the United Nations a mere caricature of its intended purpose, resulting in conflicts and violations of sovereign state rights, including war crimes and genocide, all in clear violation of the United Nations Charter. In his address, Gaddafi reiterated the urgent need for Africa to have a permanent seat on the Security Council, regardless of ongoing human reform efforts. He emphasized that Africa has waited far too long for this recognition, given its history of colonization, persecution, and exploitation. The African Union countries are steadfast in their demand for a permanent seat, viewing it as a debt owed from the past and a matter separate from UN reform, but one of utmost importance on the General Assembly's agenda. The undeniable worthiness of the African Union for a permanent seat leaves little room for argument. Any challenge to this idea would require substantial evidence to discredit the African Union or the continent's qualifications for such a position. This speech has been cited as a primary motive for the targeting and assassination of Gaddafi, with NATO's intervention in Libya driven by concerns about war crimes and crimes against humanity. The main objective was to remove him from power, even at the expense of circulating misleading information that was accepted not only internationally, but also by Libyans and Africans, ultimately gaining endorsement from the United Nations. What are your thoughts on this matter? Share them in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more insightful videos like this.